A randomized control trial of bone loss in postmenopausal black women found that women given vitamin D of 800 IU per day were 3 times less likely to report cold and flu symptoms than controls given a placebo. Hey everyone, thanks for tuning in. Steven here with Team Euphoric, and today I've got 2 new studies for you on the efficacy of vitamin D with regard to influenza. And I don't want to waste your time, so let's just go ahead and hop right on into the first study. This first study comes from the International Journal of Infectious Diseases, and it is called The Seasonality of Pandemic and Non-Pandemic Influenzas, the Roles of Solar Radiation and Vitamin D. It was received in April of 2010, and it was accepted on September of 2010. And as with other studies that I have brought to your attention in the past, once again, the authors note the seasonality with regard to influenza. The authors state nearly all human diseases related to respiratory pathogens exhibit seasonal variations. However, the reason for this seasonality are still not known. Among the tested hypotheses are seasonality of low temperatures, absolute humidity, dry air, crowding together indoors during the winter, travel patterns, vacations, seasonality of ultraviolet radiation from the sun that might kill pathogens, circannual rhythms of hormones such as the dark hormone melatonin, etc. Another founded hypothesis is that seasonal variations in UVB radiation and consequently vitamin D photosynthesis causing seasonal variations in vitamin D status, which play a role in the immune response to infections, may be responsible for the influenza seasonality. Additionally, the question of whether it is the host or the virus/bacterium that exhibits seasonality arises. However, there are exceptions from seasonality, notably for pandemic influenzas, which often occur outside the winter influenza seasons. Furthermore, in equatorial regions, the seasonal pattern is weak. And with regard to this, the authors also go into the influenza cases and the deaths. And what they note is that data from various sources were used in the present study, figures 1 to 6. The numbers of weekly Russian influenza cases in Sweden, figure 1, are from the publication by Skog et al. The monthly death rates from influenza in Norway during 1980 to 1909 from figure 2 are from the publication of Mohn et al. The weekly death rates of the Spanish flu in some American cities in figure 3 were obtained from the work of Britain. Monthly death rates from 10 non-pandemic and 2 pandemic influenza seasons in the USA during 1941 to 1976, which is in figure 4, are from the publication by Doshi. The pattern of monthly influenza cases in Okinawa from 2001 to 2007, figure 6, are from Suzuki et al., while the data for the Singapore from 1990 to 1994, figure 5, are from the publication by Chu et al. And I want to go over a couple of these different tables that they are referencing. The first one that I would like to go over is table 1, and it is with regard to infections and UVB exposure. It is figure 1, number of infected persons per Thyssen's area in Sweden for each week from 1889 to 1890 during the Russian flu, obtained from Skog et al. Weekly photosynthesis of vitamin D, which is the little circular line that is traveling, for a relevant latitude of 60 degrees north in Oslo, was calculated by use of vitamin D action spectrum, UV measurements, and radiative transfer calculations. See methods and materials. And as you can see from this graph, the square boxes, those are going to be the infected persons, and it goes from week 49 to week 9. So the way that this works is week 1 is going to be the first week of January, week 52 is going to be the last week in December. So that's exactly what those numbers at the bottom mean. Number of patients, that is multiplied by 1,000, so 200 would mean 200,000 cases. And you can see week 49 cases are fairly low, and then they start to creep up. They end up peaking in week 1, which is going to be the 1st of January. So pretty much the month of December and January is when it's at its highest. And then as the UVB radiation starts to go up in month 5, you can see that there is an inverse relationship between UVB exposure and number of people that are infected. As UVB exposure increases, the number of infected patients ends up decreasing. So there's an inverse correlation between UVB exposure and infected patients. And then in table 2 ends up going into the deaths and UVB exposure. And once again, we can see that they go, this one over here, they measure it by month. So it's month 1 to 12. 1 is obviously January, 12 is obviously December. And you could see, once again, this is figure 2, the monthly influenza deaths, which are the square, from 1980 to 1999 in Norway, extracted from Mohn et al. Monthly photosynthesis of vitamin D for Oslo, which is at 60 degrees north, was calculated by use of the vitamin D action spectrum, UV measurements, and radiative transfer calculation. And again, once you can see, as the UVB exposure increases around month 4, which is going to be April, you can see that the cases start to drop down. Cases are going to be highest in December and also in November and January. And then pretty much in the spring and summer months, the cases are almost non-existent. They're very, very low. So once again, this shows an inverse relationship with regard to UVB exposure and death rates with regard to influenza. As UVB exposure increases, the death rates go down. When UVB exposure is at its lowest, that is when the death rate is at its highest. And then one more table that I would like to take you through. This one over here, it goes over the monthly death rate and UVB exposure. This is table 4, and it is the monthly death rates from 2 pandemic A and 10 non-pandemic B and C influenza seasons in the USA during 1941 to 1976, data from Doshi. Monthly photosynthesis of vitamin D for San Francisco, which is at 37 degrees north, and Baltimore, which is at 39 degrees north, was calculated by use of the vitamin D action spectrum, UV measurements, and radiative transfer calculations. See materials and methods. So in the top one, once again, we could see those, the black line with the black squares and then the kind of dotted line with the white squares. Those ones over there are the UVB dose in San Francisco, which is the colored in squares. And then the clear squares are going to be the UVB dose in Baltimore. And you can see that as UVB radiation goes down, the death rates go up. And as UVB radiation increases, the death rates plummet. So this again shows the inverse relationship between UVB exposure and the death rate, and how the more UVB exposure you get, this is going to give you a protective effect against influenza and getting serious complications. Same thing with the second graph, the non-pandemic graph. With the non-pandemic graph, this one is more like the seasonal flu, so it has a very typical pattern, whereas with the pandemic graph, where it was a little bit more scattered, you had some outside of the typical seasons. With the non-pandemic graph, as UVB exposure is at its highest, the death rates are going to be very, very low, and the same thing is true with the non-pandemic death rate. This one over here, I don't know why they did this like this, but it starts out at month 7, which is July, and then it ends at month 6. So when you see the big spike in the middle, if you're just looking at this without looking at the actual month, you might be confused and thinking, wow, the death rates really spiked in the summer. But that is actually the winter time, because the center of the graph is going to be month 12 and 1. So when UVB exposure is at its absolute lowest between January and December, that is when the death rate ends up spiking in graphs B and C. And that was the second table that I wanted to bring to your attention. The next thing, the authors also noted the mechanisms behind the seasonality of influenza. And they note, being the main source of vitamin D, UVB radiation may affect influenza via the immune system. It was demonstrated in 2 independent studies that children who were regularly exposed to artificial UVB radiation had around 2 times lower incident rates of respiratory tract infections, influenza, and sore throat than non-exposed children, and the phagocytic activity of macrophages increased significantly in all exposed subjects in a dose-dependent manner. The impact of rurality on morbidity and mortality from the 1918 pandemic influenza in England, Wales, New Zealand, and Japan was investigated. The influenza morbidity in villages was higher than that or similar to that in towns and cities, while the mortality appeared to be lower in villages, revealing significant differences compared to cities and towns. The differences in mortality rates between urban and rural regions may be related to many factors, including differences in vitamin D status. People living in rural areas have significantly higher vitamin D levels compared to those living in urban areas. So basically, this just shows, again, the correlation between UVB exposure and with regard to influenza. The higher the UVB exposure, the lower the rate of influenza. The lower the rate of UVB exposure, the higher the rate of influenza. And this makes a lot of sense, because typically people in the city, there's not a whole lot of nature that you could kind of go out and walk. So a lot of people in the city, they will tend to stay indoors a lot more, whereas if you are living more in the countryside, you have a lot of open land, so you have a lot more time to go out, and people just don't spend much time indoors. So it would make sense that if you live in the countryside where you have a lot more sunlight available and you're outside a lot more because you don't have much to do but to go outside, that your vitamin D status is going to be higher, and that is going to minimize your adverse symptoms with regard to influenza. So if you do live in the city, one thing that you can do aside from taking vitamin D is get out of your apartment a little bit more. Don't get cooped up in there. If you go outside, you can increase your vitamin D levels, and by increasing your vitamin D levels, this is going to help to minimize chances of developing adverse symptoms with regard to influenza. And then the authors also note with regard to supplementation of vitamin D, what would be effective doses to prevent influenza. The authors note, solar radiation contributes significantly to vitamin D status. In temperate regions, vitamin D levels are higher in late summer than in late winter when the solar radiation contains too little UVB to synthesize enough vitamin D in human skin. Cannell et al. Hypothesized that wintertime vitamin D insufficiency may explain seasonal variation in influenza. 2 preliminary studies support this hypothesis. A randomized control trial of bone loss in postmenopausal black women found that women given vitamin D of 800 IU per day were 3 times less likely to report cold and flu symptoms than controls given a placebo. The intake of high doses of vitamin D of 2000 IU per day for 1 year efficiently protected women against the typical winter colds and influenza, since only 1 patient reported these symptoms. Another randomized double-blind placebo-controlled trial comparing vitamin D supplements with placebo in school children found that the intake of vitamin D at 1200 IU per day during winter and early spring can reduce the incidence of seasonal influenza by a factor of around 2, while this is not true for influenza B. And based off of this information, what exactly did the authors conclude? Well, non-pandemic influenzas usually arrive in winter/early spring, while the initial wave of pandemic influenzas may occur in any season, but with secondary waves in midwinter. Seasonal waves of all influenzas are small at low latitudes. It seems likely that seasonal variations in the incidence and death rates of both pandemic and non-pandemic influenza are related to seasonal variations in vitamin D status. An argument against this hypothesis might be that influenza death rates start to increase almost 2 months after the vitamin D levels have reached their minimum. Similarly, the death rates start to decrease several months before vitamin D levels start to increase significantly. This is likely to be related to the generation of immunity. And that's pretty much it for the first study. The second study that I'm going to be discussing right now, this one's very, very quick. We're going to get through it in a couple minutes. And this one comes from the Journal of Dermato-Endocrinology. It was published in November and December of 2009, and it is called Influenza, Solar Radiation, and Vitamin D. A brief report, and indeed was a brief. It did not take me much to go through this one. But anyway, with this one, as with all of the other studies, once again, they end up noting the seasonality of influenza. The authors state, nearly all human diseases related to respiratory pathogens exhibit seasonal variations. The reasons for the seasonality, however, are still not known. Among the poorly tested hypotheses are seasonality of low temperatures, of dry air, of crowding together in indoor in the winter, traveling patterns, vacations, seasonality of ultraviolet radiation from the sun that might kill pathogens, circannual rhythms of hormones like the dark hormone melatonin, and additionally, the question of whether it is the host or the virobacteria that exhibits seasonality arises. In the present work, we have compared the seasonality of deaths of influenza and pneumonia in Norway with those of vitamin D photosynthesis and vitamin D serum levels. Now, with regard to this one, they did bring up a couple of tables. I'm going to take you through one of the tables right now. This first one, it's the number of deaths with serum D levels. It is figure 1, seasonal variations of serum levels of vitamin D, which is the upside down triangle, in the Nordic countries given as averages from 3 reports in reference 9. Photosynthesis of vitamin D for southern Norway, which is the square, is calculated by use of the action spectrum in reference 7, UV measurements in Oslo, and radiative transfer calculations using a cylinder model as described in the text. The results are presented in relative units. Influenza deaths in 2 periods and in Norway are also given. And pretty much for this one over here, the red line and the blue line have to do with vitamin D status. Vitamin D formation is the bottom one, which is the blue line, and then serum 25-hydroxy vitamin D levels are the red line. And in this particular graph, they are measuring vitamin D status as calcidiol level in nanomoles per liter. And once again, we can see that there is a lot of seasonal variations. We can see that the red and the blue line, as they increase, the cases end up decreasing. So the green, the black dotted line, and the grayish one, those ones all over there, they are at their highest in month 1, which is going to be January, and then they peak again in month 12, which is December, and then they are at their lowest point between months 5 all the way to months 10. So pretty much between May all the way up until October, that is when the UVB radiation, not UVB radiation, that is when 25-hydroxy vitamin D levels are at their highest in these participants, and the number of deaths due due to influenza are at their lowest. So once again, we have this inverse relationship where as vitamin D levels go up, influenza deaths go down, and vice versa. When vitamin D status is at its lowest, that is when influenza deaths are at their highest. So once again, this shows a relationship between the seasonality and also vitamin D status with regard to influenza. And what exactly did the authors conclude with this study? In conclusion, our data are in agreement with the assumption that the higher numbers of winter influenza and pneumonia deaths in Norway are related to low vitamin D levels in this season. So there you have it. Those are pretty much the two studies. And the key takeaways from this are, as UVB radiation increases and as serum 25-hydroxy vitamin D levels are at their highest, that is when death rates and also cases of influenza are going to be at their lowest. And then the opposite is true. When UVB radiation is at its lowest and when 25-hydroxy vitamin D levels are at their lowest, that is when cases and deaths are going to be at their highest. And another thing that was noted in this study was as you get higher up in latitude and further south in latitude, closer to the poles, once again, the sun's rays are not going to be as strong. So you are not going to get the benefits of vitamin D if you live close to those areas in the wintertime, because the rays are not going to be as strong to be able to allow your body to synthesize the production of vitamin D. So if you are somebody who lives somewhere where it's very cold, if you're somebody that doesn't go outside a lot, if you are somebody who lives very, very close to the poles, then in those cases, supplementing with vitamin D would be an effective strategy to be able to protect yourself against influenza and developing serious adverse effects. Now, it's not a guarantee. You can take vitamin D, you could have good vitamin D levels, you could still get sick, but there's a strong correlation, and by taking vitamin D supplementation, if you are deficient, then it can help to protect you. With regard to vitamin D status, once again, you want to get your vitamin D levels checked before you start doing any type of crazy supplement protocols. Ideally, 80 to 100 nanograms per milliliter is where you want to be at. Anything below 80, if you are between 50 to 80, that is going to be considered adequate. Below 50 is going to be considered insufficient. Below 30 is going to be considered deficient. So if you are below 30 nanograms per milliliter of serum 25-hydroxy vitamin D, then you would want to consider going on a megadose, but speak to your doctor, see if it's appropriate. If you are between 30 to 50, then that is considered insufficient. So you may not need to go on a megadose, but a higher dosage than the recommended daily allowance would be warranted. I've mentioned this in other videos in the past, but several studies have shown that if you go on a dose of 2,000 IU per day over the course of a year, when they measured the 25-hydroxy vitamin D levels in postmenopausal African-American women, they found that 2,000 IU a day for an entire year didn't make a dent in their 25-hydroxy vitamin D status. And at 5,000 IU, they were actually able to see an increase in their vitamin D status. So if you are somebody between the levels of 30 to 50 nanograms per milliliter, then consuming something like a 5,000 IU dose would be an effective dose at helping you to prevent against influenza. But again, get your levels checked, talk to your doctor, see what they recommend. But that's pretty much it for today's video. If you enjoyed the video, be sure to smash that like button so I know to make more of these types of videos in the future. And if you're either new to the channel or haven't subscribed yet, be sure to subscribe to the channel and hit the notification bell, as I will be uploading new videos every single day. That's it for today's video. Thanks for tuning in, and I will see you again tomorrow.